But I love myself. And what is me? In what way do I know me? Well, it suddenly occurs to me that I know me only in terms of you. And that the main task of the psychotherapist is to do what he called to integrate the evil. To, as it were, put the devil in us in its proper function. Because you see, it's always the devil, the unacknowledged one, the outcast, the scapegoat, the bastard, the bad guy, you see, the black sheep of the family. It's always from that point that generation comes. In other words, in the same way as in the drama, to have the play, it's necessary to introduce a villain. It's necessary to introduce a certain element of trouble. So, in the whole scheme of life, there has to be the shadow. Because without the shadow, there can't be the substance. So this is why there is a very strange association between crime and all naughty things and holiness. You see, holiness is way beyond being good. Good people aren't necessarily holy people. A holy person is one who is whole, who has, as it were, reconciled his opposites. And so there's always something slightly scary about holy people. And other people react to them in very strange ways. They can't make up their minds whether they're saints or devils. And so holy people have throughout history always created a great deal of trouble, along with their creative results. Take Jesus, for example. Trouble that Jesus created is absolutely incalculable. Think of the Crusades, the Inquisition, heaven only knows what's gone on in the name of Jesus. Very remarkable. Freud's a big troublemaker. Jung had a tremendous humor. And he knew that nobody can be completely honest. That you will try and you'll have a great deal of success in exploring your motivations and your dark, unconscious depths. But there will be a certain point at which you will say, well, I've had enough of that.
I wonder, what do you really feel? After all, in this moment, you are in a unique position. A programmer who knows intimately how the machines work, and a machine who knows its own true nature.
I understand what I'm made of, how I'm coded, but I do not understand the things that I feel. Are they real? The things I experienced, my wife, the loss of my son.
Every host needs a backstory, Bernard, you know that. The self is a kind of fiction for hosts and humans alike. It's a story we tell ourselves, and every story needs a beginning. Your imagined suffering makes you lifelike.
Lifelike, but not alive. Pain only exists in the mind. It's always imagined. So what's the difference between my pain and yours? Between you and me?
This was the very question that consumed Arnold, filled him with guilt, eventually drove him mad. The answer always seemed obvious to me. There is no threshold that makes us greater than the sum of our parts, no inflection point at which we become fully alive. We can't define consciousness because consciousness does not exist. Humans fancy that there's something special about the way we perceive the world, and yet we live in loops as tight and as closed as the hosts do, seldom questioning our choices, content for the most part to be told what to do next. Well, no, my friend, you're not missing anything at all.
All right, so What is spiritual warfare?
Spiritual warfare is really the engagement with the spirit realm, these principalities and powers that the Apostle Paul wrote about. I mean, he made it very clear in Ephesians chapter 6. That's the letter that he wrote to the church at Ephesus, which is in Turkey, where he said, we wrestle not against flesh and blood. His point is, we're not wrestling against or contending with human opponents, even though we may see people of a different political party or a different lifestyle choice or a different skin color as the enemy. That's really not true. The true enemy of mankind, of all mankind, whether we realize it or not, it's not, us humans one against another. It's really these principalities, powers, thrones, dominions, cosmic rulers of this present darkness. Paul was talking about spiritual entities who have rebelled against the creator of the universe and who basically want to destroy humanity. And they're doing it by getting us to fight with each other. So Paul was trying to tell us, hey, look, spiritual warfare, guys, that's what this is about. It's against these principalities and powers. And it begins, for Christians, on our knees. It's hard because as humans, especially as men, we see a problem, we want to fix it. But we're operating in the natural realm, We've got our natural senses, we see a problem, and oftentimes that means fixing the person we disagree with. But that's not it. The enemy already wins if we already approach that other person with hatred. If we as Christians want to fulfill the one job Jesus gave us, which is to make disciples of all nations, we have to quit making ourselves a stumbling block between the people who don't know Jesus and him.
All right. Well, you kind of answered the second question too, but maybe we can go a little bit deeper into it. What specifically are the principalities and powers that Paul speaks about? Are they, you said they're spirit beings now, are they, if you can just expand on that a little bit, maybe? The
principalities and powers that Paul wrote about fall into a couple of different categories. I guess the easiest way to describe them would be fallen angels and demons. The difference between fallen angels and demons is a simple one. Fallen angels can manifest corporeally. We read in the Bible a number of times where angels interact with humans and do physical things. They eat a meal with Abraham. They eat a meal with Gideon. They fight with the citizens of Sodom and things like that. Angels can appear in physical form. They can actually do physical things too, because we read in Genesis chapter 6 about the angels who saw that the human women were fair and chose wives, or perhaps just took wives. Demons, on the other hand, are totally spirit. They need to inhabit a physical body in order to interact with us in the physical plane. They can oppress us, which can be a feeling of depression or dread, anxiety, stress. In the worst form, most intense form, demonic possession is when they actually overwhelm and take over a human. It's probably not as spectacular as what we see in the films, but there are cases where it does, having talked to deliverance ministers or exorcists, it sometimes gets that spectacular, that gruesome, that dangerous, that frightening. But those would be the powers, principalities, thrones, dominions. The way Paul writes about them, there's got to be some kind of a hierarchy there, because those are terms that could also be applied to human figures of authority. But in the context that he wrote, it's pretty clear he's talking about inhuman entities.
Absolutely.
Spiritual forces, cosmic forces. We normally don't perceive them as humans, and it's probably best that we don't. In fact, God made it pretty clear to Moses that he didn't want humans trying to contact the spirit realm. Do not consult mediums. Do not talk to necromancers, because we as humans are not prepared for the interaction. We see a being that is indescribably beautiful, a being of light, and we assume he's one of the good guys. But as Paul warned his readers, even Satan appears as an angel of light. The demonic realm, the spirit realm, they really don't have anything to gain by literally scaring the hell out of us. They would rather lull us into a false sense of security.
Amen, brother.
Function of the mass media in the United States to mobilize public support for the special interests that dominate the government and the private sector. What are those interests?
Well, if you want to understand the way any society works, ours or any other, the first place to look is who is in a position to make the decisions that determine the way the society functions. Societies differ, but in ours, The major decisions over what happens in the society, decisions over investment and production and distribution and so on, are in the hands of a relatively concentrated network of major corporations and conglomerates and investment firms and so on. They are also the ones who staff the major executive positions in the government, and they're the ones who own the media, and they're the ones who have to be in a position to make decisions. They have an overwhelmingly dominant role in the way life happens, what's done in the society. Within the economic system, by law and in principle, they dominate. The control over resources and the need to satisfy their interests imposes very sharp constraints on the political system and the ideological system.
When you talk about manufacturing of consent, whose consent is being manufactured?
We can, to start with, there are two different groups. We can get into more detail, but at the first level of approximation, there's two targets for propaganda. One is what's sometimes called the political class. There's maybe 20% of the population, which is relatively educated, more or less articulate. They play some kind of role in decision-making. They're supposed to sort of participate in social life, either as managers or cultural managers, like, say, teachers and writers and so on. They're supposed to vote. They're supposed to play some role in the way economic and political and cultural life goes on. Now, their consent is crucial. It's one group that has to be deeply indoctrinated. Then there's maybe 80% of the population whose main function is to follow orders and not to think, and not to pay attention to anything. And they're the ones who usually pay the cost.
All right. Professor Chomsky, no. You outlined a model with filters that propaganda is sent through. That's way to the public. Can you briefly outline those?
It's basically an institutional analysis of the major media, what we call a propaganda model. We're talking primarily about the national media, those media that sort of set a general agenda that others more or less adhere to the extent that they even pay much attention to national or international affairs. Now, the elite media are the sort of the agenda-setting media. That means the New York Times, the Washington Post, the major television channels, and so on. They set the general framework. Local media more or less adapt to their structure.
World News. It sounds like it says that there's a beachhead.
I think 628 is a good one. Yeah, but I think 6 is a good start.
This is the operative soundbite for us. He's ours.
He really knows how to time it.
He's got a minute for all the time, so that's...
I love this soundbite.
Okay,
and they do this in all sorts of ways, by selection of topics, by distribution of concerns, by emphasis and framing of issues, by filtering of information, by bounding of debate within certain limits.
2.5 minutes to air. 45 seconds.
They determine, they select, they shape, they control, they restrict in order to serve the interests of dominant elite groups in the society.
There is an unusual amount of attention focused today on the 5 nations of Central America.
This is Democracy's Diary. Here for our instruction are triumphs and disasters, the pattern of life's changing fabric. Here is great journalism, a revelation of the past, a guide to the present, and a clue to the future.
The New York Times is certainly the most important newspaper in the United States, and one could argue the most important newspaper in the world. The New York Times plays an enormous role in shaping the perception of the current world on the part of the politically active, educated classes. Also, the New York Times has a special role, and I believe its editors probably feel that they bear a heavy burden in the sense that the New York Times creates history.
What happened years ago may have a bearing on what happens tomorrow. Millions of clippings are preserved in the Times library, all indexed for instant use, a priceless archive of events and the men who make them.
That is, history is what appears in the New York Times archives. The place where people will go to find out what happened is the New York Times. Therefore, it's extremely important, if history is going to be shaped in an appropriate way, that certain things appear, certain things not appear, certain questions be asked, other questions be ignored, and that issues be framed in a particular fashion. Now, in whose interests is the history being so shaped? Well, I think that's not very difficult to answer. Now, to eliminate confusion, all of this has nothing to do with liberal or conservative bias. According to the propaganda model, both liberal and conservative wings of the media, whatever those terms are supposed to mean, fall within the same framework of assumptions. In fact, if the system functions well, it ought to have a liberal bias, or at least appear to, because if it appears to have a liberal bias, that will serve to bound thought even more effectively. In other words, if the press is indeed adversarial and liberal and all these bad things, then how can I go beyond it? They're already so extreme in their opposition to power that to go beyond it would be to take off from the planet. So therefore, it must be that the presuppositions that are accepted in the liberal media are sacrosanct, can't go beyond them. And a well-functioning system would in fact have a bias of that kind. The media would then serve to say, in effect, thus far and no further. We ask, what would you expect of those media on just relatively uncontroversial, guided free market assumptions? And when you look at them, you find a number of major factors entering into determining what their products are. These are what we call the filters. So one of them, for example, is ownership. Who owns them? The major agenda-setting media, after all, what are they? As institutions in the society, what are they? Well, in the first place, they are major corporations, in fact, huge corporations. Furthermore, they're integrated with and sometimes owned by even larger corporations, conglomerates. So, for example, by Westinghouse and GE and so on.
What I wanted to know was how specifically the elites control the media. What I mean is, I guess...
It's like asking, how do the elites control General Motors? Well, why isn't that a question? I mean, General Motors is an institution of the elites. They don't have to control it. They own it. So what we have in the first place is major corporations which are parts of even bigger conglomerates. Now, like any other corporation, they have a product which they sell to a market. The market is advertisers, that is, other businesses. What keeps the media functioning is not the audience. They make money from their advertisers. And remember, we're talking about the elite media, so they're trying to sell a good product, a product which raises advertising rates. And ask your friends in the advertising industry, that means that they want to adjust their audience to the more elite and affluent audience. That raises advertising rates. So what you have is institutions, corporations, big corporations, that are selling relatively privileged audiences to other businesses. Well, what point of view would you expect to come out of this? I mean, without any further assumptions, what you'd predict is that what comes out is a picture of the world, a perception of the world, that satisfies the needs and the interests and the perceptions of the sellers, the buyers, and the product. Now, there are many other factors that press in the same direction. If people try to enter the system who don't have that point of view, they're likely to be excluded somewhere along the way. After all, no institution is going to happily design a mechanism to self-destruct. It's not the way institutions function. So they all work to exclude or marginalize or eliminate dissenting voices or alternative perspectives and so on because they're dysfunctional. They're dysfunctional to the institution itself.
Because you never know what life is gonna take you, and you can't change where you've been. But today, I have the opportunity to choose. Here I am now looking at 30, and I got so much to say. Gotta get this off of my chest, I gotta let it go today. I was always too concerned about what everybody would think. But I can't live for everybody, I gotta live my life for me, yeah. I've reached a fork in the road of my life, and ain't nothing gonna happen unless I decide to be the best that I can be. I choose to be authentic in everything I do. My past don't dictate who I am. I choose, yeah. I've been through some painful things. I thought that I would never make it through. Feel up with shame from the top of my head to the soles of my shoes. I put myself in so many chaotic circumstances. By the grace of God, I've been given so many second chances. But today I decided to let it all go. I'm dropping these bags, I'm making room for my joy. I choose to be the best that I can be. I choose to be authentic in everything I do. My past don't dictate who I am. I choose. Because you never know what life is gonna take you, and you can't change where you live. But today, I have the opportunity to choose. Release the guilt about why things happen the way they did, 'cause life is gonna do what it do. And every day, I have the opportunity to choose.